The corporate recruiter looked at my resume like I'd handed her a grocery list, her manicured fingers barely touching the paper as if my lack of qualifications might be contagious. She didn't even bother to hide her eye roll when I mentioned my leadership experience. "Listen, honey," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of condescension that made my jaw clench. "Retail management and food service don't really translate to corporate leadership. Maybe try the community college booth for some basic skills training." She slid my resume back across the table without another glance, already reaching for the next person in line. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. That's when I heard a voice behind me that made every muscle on my body snap to attention. "Excuse me, did you just dismiss Commander Sarah Davis?" The question cut through the noise of the crowded career fair like a blade, and suddenly, the entire corporate recruiting booth went dead silent. I turned around slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs, to see a Navy recruiter in dress blues standing there with the kind of presence that made everyone within a 20-foot radius stop what they were doing and pay attention. The corporate recruiter's face went from smug dismissal to confused panic in about 2 seconds flat. "I'm sorry, Commander who?" she stammered, looking between me and the recruiter like someone had just started speaking in ancient Greek. That's when Staff Sergeant Martinez, the Marine recruiter from 3 booths over, looked up from his paperwork and said the words that changed everything. "Holy hell, that's Commander Davis. Ma'am, we've been waiting for you." The morning had started like any other Tuesday in my new civilian life, which meant I woke up at 0500 out of pure habit, stared at the ceiling for 10 minutes, wondering what the hell I was supposed to do with myself, then got up and made coffee strong enough to wake the dead. 6 months out of the Navy, and I still couldn't shake the routine that had governed my life for the past 12 years. The alarm clock on my nightstand was purely decorative at this point. My internal chronometer was more reliable than any piece of electronic equipment. I'd been living in my sister's spare bedroom in Phoenix since my separation from active duty, trying to figure out how to translate "commanded a destroyer escort through 3 combat deployments" into something that looked good on a civilian resume. Turns out, explaining why being responsible for 300 sailors and millions of dollars worth of equipment qualified you for middle management was harder than I'd expected. Every job application felt like trying to explain color to someone who'd been blind their whole life. The Phoenix Metro Career Fair was being held at the convention center downtown, one of those massive events where hundreds of companies set up booths and thousands of job seekers wandered around like lost sheep, clutching resumes and hoping someone would see their potential. I'd been to 3 of these things already, and each one had been more soul-crushing than the last. Somehow, 12 years of military service, including command of a warship, had been reduced to lacks relevant civilian experience on every rejection letter I'd received. I'd chosen my outfit carefully that morning, a conservative navy blue blazer and slacks that I hope said professional without screaming military. I'd learned the hard way that mentioning my service too early in the conversation tended to make civilian recruiters nervous. They'd get this look in their eyes like I might start barking orders or insisting everyone address me by rank. The truth was, I missed having people call me commander more than I'd ever admit out loud, but that part of my life was over now. The convention center was already packed by the time I arrived at 0900, streams of people flowing between rows of corporate booths like water finding its way downhill. The air smelled like industrial carpet and desperation, mixed with the aggressive optimism of recruiters who'd had too much coffee and not enough sleep. I'd mapped out my route the night before, identifying the companies that might be interested in someone with my background, though I was learning to keep my expectations low. My first stop was Tech Global Solutions, a consulting firm that claimed they valued innovative leadership and cross-functional expertise. The recruiter was a guy about my age in an expensive suit who looked like he'd stepped out of a business school brochure. He glanced at my resume for maybe 30 seconds before delivering the same script I'd heard a dozen times before. "Your military experience is certainly impressive," he said with the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes, "but we're really looking for candidates with direct industry experience, someone who understands the corporate environment, you know? Maybe if you got an MBA first, we could revisit this conversation in a few years." I thanked him politely and moved on, swallowing the urge to mention that I'd managed bigger budgets and more complex logistics than his entire company probably handled in a year. The next booth was worse. Global Tech Industries had a recruiter who seemed personally offended that I'd wasted her time with my inadequate qualifications. "Leadership in the military is completely different from corporate leadership," she explained, as if she was talking to a child. "In business, you have to actually motivate people, not just order them around. You need emotional intelligence, strategic thinking, the ability to work with diverse teams. Each word felt like a small slap, and I found myself wondering if she'd ever tried to keep morale up on a ship that had been at sea for 8 months straight, or made life-and-death decisions with incomplete information while responsible for hundreds of lives. By the time I reached Pinnacle Marketing Group, I was already feeling the familiar weight of disappointment settling in my chest. Their booth was staffed by a woman who couldn't have been older than 25, wearing a power suit that probably cost more than I'd made in a month as a junior officer. She had the kind of confidence that comes from never being told no by anyone that mattered, and the second she saw my resume, I could tell she'd already written me off. "So you've been in the Navy," she said, like it was a minor character flaw she was willing to overlook. "That's nice, but what we're really looking for is someone with real-world experience. Business development, client relations, market analysis, actual skills." That's when something inside me finally snapped. Not visibly, I'd learned too much self-control for that, but I felt the last of my patience evaporate like morning dew. I managed a crew of 300 personnel, oversaw operations budgets in excess of $50 million annually, coordinated with international partners across multiple time zones and languages, developed strategic plans for complex maritime operations. She waved her hand dismissively. "That's all fine, but it's not business experience. Look, honey, military leadership is just following orders and making sure other people follow orders. In the corporate world, we need innovative thinking, relationship building, the ability to work without someone telling you exactly what to do every step of the way." The word honey hit me like a physical blow. I'd been called a lot of things during my military career, some of them less than flattering, but I'd earned the right to be addressed with respect. This kid, who probably hadn't managed more than her college sorority's social calendar, was talking to me like I was some kind of trained SEAL who'd forgotten how to think for myself. "Maybe you should consider starting at an entry-level position," she continued, clearly warming to her theme. "Something in customer service or sales support. You could work your way up over a few years, learn how real businesses operate. I know it might seem like a step backwards, but you gotta start somewhere." I took my resume back from her with as much dignity as I could muster, nodded politely, and walked away before I said something that would end up on the evening news.
Behind me, I could hear her talking to her colleague about these military types who think their experience translates to everything, and it took every ounce of self-control I possessed not to turn around and educate her about exactly what my experience had taught me. That's how I ended up at the Meridian Financial Services booth, which was where this whole story really began. The recruiter there was a middle-aged woman named Patricia Hoffman, according to her name tag, who had the kind of aggressive professionalism that made me think she'd climbed her way to the top by stepping on anyone who got in her way. She was on the phone when I approached, having what sounded like a heated conversation about quarterly projections and market positioning. While I waited, I looked around at the other booths nearby. There was a cluster of military recruiters set up in the corner, representatives from all the branches trying to convince college kids and career changers to consider service. I'd walked past them earlier without stopping, partly because I wasn't interested in going back to active duty, but mostly because I wasn't sure I was ready to be around that world again. 6 months wasn't long enough to stop missing it, and I didn't need the reminder of what I'd left behind. Patricia finally finished her call and turned her attention to me, with the kind of forced smile that suggested she'd rather be anywhere else. "Sorry about that," she said, though she didn't sound particularly sorry. "Crisis management, you know how it is. What can I do for you?" I handed her my resume and launched into my carefully practiced pitch about transitional leadership skills and operational management experience. She listened with the expression of someone who was already planning her lunch order, occasionally making non-committal humming sounds that might have been interest or might have been boredom. "So you've been in the military," she said when I finished, glancing at my resume like it was written in a foreign language. "That's interesting. What kind of work are you looking for exactly? Something in management or operations? Team leadership, strategic planning, project management? I have extensive experience in all of those areas." Patricia frowned at my resume, then looked back at me with the kind of expression reserved for people who just claimed they could fly. "I hate to break this to you, but military experience doesn't really count as management experience. Not in the real world, anyway. You're basically starting from scratch here." The familiar knot of frustration tightened in my stomach. "I commanded a guided missile destroyer," I said, trying to keep the edge out of my voice. I was responsible for a crew of over 300 people, managed complex operations across multiple theaters, coordinated with international allies on sensitive missions. "That's nice," Patricia said, her tone suggesting it was anything but. But managing soldiers is completely different from managing employees. In the corporate world, people can quit if they don't like their job. You can't just order them around and expect them to follow blindly. You need actual leadership skills, emotional intelligence, the ability to motivate people through inspiration rather than intimidation. Each word felt like a small knife twisting in my chest. I had spent 12 years developing exactly those skills, learning how to earn loyalty and respect from people who were risking their lives based on my decisions. I'd held crews together for months-long deployments, navigated international incidents that could have started wars, made split-second decisions that saved lives and prevented disasters. But apparently, none of that mattered if it happened while wearing a uniform. "Look," Patricia continued, warming to her theme, "I'm sure you're a nice person, and thank you for your service and all that, but the truth is, you don't have any real business experience. No sales background, no client relations, no understanding of profit and loss or market dynamics. Maybe you should think about going back to school, getting an MBA or something. Learn some actual business skills instead of just military stuff." That's when I noticed that our conversation was starting to attract attention from the neighboring booths. A few other recruiters had stopped what they were doing to listen, and I could see some of them nodding along with Patricia's assessment. Great, I thought. Now I'm becoming the cautionary tale about delusional veterans who think their service qualifies them for real jobs. "I understand you think highly of your military service," Patricia said, her voice taking on the patronizing tone usually reserved for explaining things to children, "but retail management and food service supervision don't really translate to corporate leadership. We need people who understand business, not people who are used to having their decisions followed without question." I felt my face flush with a combination of anger and humiliation. She was talking about my military service like it was something I'd done as a hobby, like commanding a billion-dollar warship was equivalent to managing a McDonald's. The worst part was that I could see other people starting to gather around, drawn by the commotion like spectators at a car accident. "Maybe you should try the community college booth," Patricia suggested, gesturing vaguely toward the back of the convention center. "They have some great programs for veterans who want to learn basic business skills. Start with something simple, work your way up. I know it might seem like starting over, but honestly, that's exactly what you need to do." The word basic hit me like a slap across the face. Basic business skills? As if the last 12 years of my life had been some kind of elaborate game of pretend, and now it was time to learn how the real world worked. I felt something inside me starting to crack. The careful composure I'd been maintaining for 6 months beginning to crumble under the weight of constant rejection and dismissal. "Look, honey," and there was that word again, delivered with the kind of condescending sweetness that made my teeth ache. "I can see you're passionate about this, and that's admirable, but passion doesn't make up for experience. You need to be realistic about your qualifications. Military service is fine for what it is, but it's not business experience. It's not leadership experience, not the kind that matters in the corporate world." She slid my resume back across the table toward me, her manic nails clicking against the laminated surface. "Maybe try some of the other booths. I'm sure someone here is looking for entry-level candidates who are willing to start at the bottom and work their way up." That's when I heard the voice behind me, the one that made my spine straighten automatically and my heart start hammering against my ribs. "Excuse me? Did you just dismiss Commander Sarah Davis?" The question cut through the noise of the career fair like a knife through silk, and suddenly the entire area around the Meridian Financial Services booth went dead quiet. I turned around slowly, already knowing what I was going to see, but still not quite believing it was happening. Standing about 10 feet away was a Navy recruiter in dress blues, his uniform immaculate and his bearing exactly what you'd expect from someone who spent his career in the service.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Petty Officer First Class Rodriguez, according to his name tag, had the kind of presence that made everyone within a 20-foot radius stop what they were doing and pay attention. But it wasn't just his uniform or his posture that commanded respect. It was the way he looked at me, with immediate recognition and something that might have been relief. Patricia's face went from smug dismissal to confused panic in about 2 seconds flat. I'm sorry, Commander who?" she stammered, looking between me and Petty Officer Rodriguez like someone had just started speaking in ancient Greek. The word commander hung in the air like an accusation, and I could see her starting to realize that maybe she'd made some kind of mistake. That's when Staff Sergeant Martinez, the Marine recruiter from 3 booths over, looked up from his paperwork and said the words that changed everything. "Holy hell, that's Commander Davis! Ma'am, we've been waiting for you." The silence that followed Staff Sergeant Martinez's words was the kind you could physically feel, heavy and electric like the air before a thunderstorm. Every conversation within earshot had stopped. Every recruiter and job seeker had turned to stare at our little corner of the convention center. Patricia's mouth was hanging open slightly, her perfectly applied lipstick making her look like a fish gasping her air. I felt my shoulders automatically square themselves, muscle memory from a dozen years of wearing the uniform taking over, even though I was dressed in civilian clothes. The way Rodriguez and Martinez were looking at me, with that immediate recognition and respect, was like stepping into a warm room after being out in the cold for months. I'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen as who I actually was instead of what someone assumed I should be. "Commander Davis," Rodriguez said, stepping closer with the kind of precise movement that spoke of decades of military bearing. "Petty Officer First Class Rodriguez, USS Hampton. I served under Captain Morrison when he was your XO on the Leyte Gulf. Sir, he's told us stories about the Strait of Hormuz incident, about how you kept that entire task force from starting a war." The mention of Tom Morrison hit me like a physical blow. My former executive officer, one of the finest officers I'd ever served with, now commanding his own ship. The fact that he'd been talking about our deployment, about that nightmare week when Iranian fast boats had been playing chicken with our destroyer and every decision could have escalated into an international crisis, made something tight in my chest start to loosen. Patricia was looking between us like we were speaking in code, her corporate confidence evaporating as she began to realize that maybe, just maybe, she'd made a catastrophic error in judgment. "I don't understand," she said, her voice smaller now, less certain. "You said you were in the Navy, but you didn't mention you were an officer." "She didn't just mention it," Martinez said, his voice carrying the kind of edge that Marines perfected in boot camp and never lost. "She told you she commanded a destroyer. That makes her a senior naval officer, ma'am, someone who's responsible for more people and equipment than most CEOs ever dream of managing." I could see other corporate recruiters starting to gather around us now, drawn by the commotion and the sudden shift in energy. Word was spreading through the military recruiting section like wildfire, and I noticed Sergeant First Class Thompson from the Army booth pulling out his phone, probably texting someone about what was happening. "Commander," Rodriguez continued, "we've actually been hoping to cross paths with you. Your transition paperwork came through our office about 6 months ago, and we've been keeping an eye out. There are some people who'd very much like to speak with you about consulting opportunities, defense contractors, logistics companies, maritime security firms, people who understand what your experience actually means." The corporate recruiters who had been so dismissive earlier were starting to gather around the edges of our conversation, their expressions ranging from confusion to dawning horror as they began to piece together exactly who they'd been talking down to all morning. I could see Tech Global's recruiter whispering urgently to his colleague, probably trying to remember what he'd said to me an hour ago. "Ma'am," Martinez said, addressing me directly, "if I don't mind me asking, what brings you to a civilian career fair? I mean, with your background in security clearance, you could write your own ticket with any number of defense contractors." That was the question I'd been dreading, partly because I wasn't sure I knew the answer myself. How do you explain that sometimes you need to prove to yourself that you can succeed in a world that doesn't understand military service? That after 12 years of being defined by rank and uniform, you want to see if you can make it on merit alone in the civilian sector? "I wanted to try something completely different," I said, aware that dozens of people were now listening to every word. "See if I could translate my experience into the corporate world, learn new industries, new challenges." Rodriguez nodded like that made perfect sense, but I could see the concern in his eyes. He'd probably seen too many transitioning service members struggle with the same challenges I'd been facing, the constant battle to make civilians understand that military leadership was real leadership, that the skills we developed in service were exactly what most companies claimed they were looking for. Patricia was still standing behind her booth table, looking like she wanted to disappear into the floor. "I had no idea. You said you had management experience, but I thought you meant like supervising a few people. I didn't realize you were talking about commanding a warship." "A guided missile destroyer," Martinez corrected her. "The USS Leyte Gulf, one of the most advanced warships in the fleet. Commander Davis was responsible for a crew of over 300 highly trained personnel, millions of dollars worth of equipment, and operations that directly impacted national security. That's not management, ma'am. That's command." The distinction between management and command was something most civilians never understood, but it was fundamental to everything we did in the military. Managers handled processes and procedures. Commanders made life-and-death decisions with incomplete information while being responsible for every soul under their care. The difference was measured in lives saved and missions accomplished, not quarterly profit reports. I could see other corporate recruiters starting to gather around us now, drawn by the commotion and the sudden shift in energy. Word was spreading through the military recruiting section like wildfire, and I noticed Sergeant First Class Thompson from the Army booth pulling out his phone, probably texting someone about what was happening. "Commander," said a voice behind me, and I turned to see a captain in dress blues walking up from the main entrance. Captain Jennifer Walsh, according to her name tag, with ribbons that told the story of someone who'd seen serious action. "Captain Walsh, Naval District, Washington. We got word you might be here today."
Everyone within 100 yards was now staring at a little corner of the convention center, and I could see people pulling out phones to record what was happening. This was rapidly becoming the kind of scene that would end up on social media and, knowing my luck, the evening news. "Ma'am," I said, falling automatically into the respectful tone I'd used with senior officers throughout my career. "I wasn't expecting to see anyone from NDW here." Captain Walsh smiled, but there was something serious in her expression that made me think this wasn't a social visit. "Commander, we need to talk. There's been a development regarding your separation paperwork, something that requires immediate attention." The words hit me like a physical blow. Separation paperwork issues were the kind of nightmare that could drag on for months or years, affecting everything from benefits to security clearances. I'd thought all of that was behind me, that my transition to civilian life was complete and irreversible. Patricia, who had been standing there looking increasingly uncomfortable, finally found her voice again. "I'm so sorry," she said, her earlier condescension replaced by obvious panic. "I had no idea about your background. If I'd known you were a commander, I never would have suggested community college or entry-level positions." "The problem isn't that you didn't know I was a commander," I said, finally allowing some of the frustration I'd been feeling for months to creep into my voice. "The problem is that you didn't listen when I told you about my experience. You heard military service and immediately decided that meant I was unqualified for anything more challenging than customer service." The crowd around us was growing larger now, and I could see other veterans in the audience nodding along with what I was saying. Apparently, I wasn't the only one who'd been having this conversation with civilian recruiters, being told that military experience didn't count as real experience. Captain Walsh stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Commander, this isn't the place for this discussion. We need to speak privately. There is a conference room we can use." But Rodriguez held up a hand. "Ma'am, with respect, I think this conversation needs to happen right here. This lady has been getting disrespected all morning by people who don't understand what military service means. Maybe it's time they learned." I could see Martinez nodding in agreement, and several other military recruiters had now joined our growing circle. There was something building here, a sense of solidarity and shared frustration that had been simmering under the surface for months. We had all heard the stories about transitioning veterans being told their experience didn't matter, being forced to start over in entry-level positions despite decades of leadership experience. "You want to know what real leadership looks like?" Martinez said, addressing the crowd of corporate recruiters who were now gathered around us. It looks like Commander Davis keeping her destroyer operational during a 7-month deployment while managing international tensions that could have started World War III. It looks like making decisions that affect hundreds of lives while operating in some of the most dangerous waters in the world. The Tech Global recruiter who had dismissed me earlier was now pushing through the crowd, probably hoping to do some damage control. "Commander Davis," he said, his earlier arrogance replaced by obvious desperation, "I think there may have been some miscommunication earlier. We're always interested in candidates with your level of experience." "No miscommunication," I said, keeping my voice level. "You told me I needed to get an MBA before you'd consider hiring me. You said I didn't understand the corporate environment or how to motivate people. Remember?" His face went through several different shades of red. "I may have been hasty in my assessment. If you'd like to discuss opportunities with our defense contracting division, I'd be happy to set up a meeting." "That's not how this works," Captain Walsh said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made everyone in the immediate area stop talking. "You don't get to insult a decorated officer and then try to backtrack when you realize who she is. Commander Davis earned her respect through 12 years of exceptional service, not through whatever game you people are playing here." I could see convention center security starting to take notice of our gathering, probably wondering if they needed to intervene in whatever was happening in the military recruiting section. The last thing I wanted was to cause a scene that would end up reflecting poorly on the service or on the other veterans who were trying to transition to civilian careers. "Ma'am," I said to Captain Walsh, "maybe we should take this to that conference room." But she shook her head. "No, Commander. I think Staff Sergeant Martinez is right. This conversation needs to happen here, where everyone can hear it. Because what's been happening to you this morning is happening to veterans all across this country, and it needs to stop." Captain Walsh turned to address the crowd of recruiters and job seekers who were now gathered around us. "This is Commander Sarah Davis, formerly commanding officer of the USS Leyte Gulf, a guided missile destroyer. During her command, she successfully completed 3 combat deployments, managed a crew of over 300 personnel, and was responsible for equipment valued at over $1 billion. The numbers hit the crowd like physical blows. $1 billion! That was more than the annual revenue of most of the companies represented at this career fair, and they'd been talking to me like I was some kind of amateur who needed basic training in business principles. Commander Davis was awarded the Bronze Star for her actions during the Strait of Hormuz crisis, where her tactical decisions prevented what could have been a major international incident. She has extensive experience in logistics, personnel management, strategic planning, and crisis management under conditions that would destroy most civilian executives. Patricia looked like she wanted to crawl under her table and disappear. The woman from Tech Global was frantically texting someone, probably her supervisor, trying to explain how she had just insulted a Bronze Star recipient at a public event. "And yet," Captain Walsh continued, her voice rising slightly, "she's been told all morning that her experience doesn't count, that military service isn't real leadership, that she needs to start over at entry-level positions and learn basic business skills." The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. I could see other veterans in the audience nodding along with what I was saying. Apparently, I wasn't the only one who'd been having this conversation with civilian recruiters, being told that military experience didn't count as real experience.
Captain Walsh pulled out her phone and made a quick call. "This is Captain Walsh. Yes, sir, she's here. The situation is as reported. We need immediate coordination with the regional commands. All of them." The phone call sent a chill down my spine. Regional commands meant this was bigger than just my separation paperwork. This was the kind of coordination that happened when something significant was about to occur. When the Navy needed to mobilize resources quickly and efficiently. Rodriguez stepped closer to me, lowering his voice. "Ma'am, I don't know what's going on with your paperwork, but I want you to know that every recruiter here has heard about commanders like you getting disrespected at these events. We've been documenting it, reporting it up the chain. Someone's finally decided to do something about it." The implication of his words hit me like a sledgehammer. This wasn't just about me or my transition to civilian life. This was about a systemic problem with how veterans were being treated in the job market. And apparently someone with enough rank to matter had decided it was time to address it publicly. Martinez was still facing down the corporate recruiters, his Marine training evident in every line of his posture. You people want to talk about leadership? Real leadership is taking responsibility for your mistakes. It's admitting when you're wrong and making things right. So far, all I've seen is excuses and damage control. The tech global recruiter was sweating now, despite the air conditioning. We're absolutely willing to make this right. Commander Davis, we'd love to discuss senior executive positions with our company. Full benefits, competitive salary, immediate start date if you're interested. What changed? I asked, genuinely curious about his sudden shift in attitude. 5 minutes ago, you told me I needed an MBA and several years of entry-level experience. Now you're offering me an executive position. What's different? He opened his mouth, then closed it again, apparently realizing that any answer he gave would just make things worse. The truth was obvious to everyone watching. The only thing that had changed was that he now understood who he'd been talking to. My qualifications hadn't changed, my experience hadn't changed, but his perception of my value has shifted completely once he realized I wasn't just some enlisted soldier looking for a job. Captain Walsh finished her phone call and turned back to the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, there's something you need to understand about military service members transitioning to civilian careers. These are people who have been tested under conditions most of you can't imagine. They've made decisions that affected national security, managed resources that dwarf most corporate budgets, and led teams through situations where failure meant people died. The convention center had gone quiet now, our little corner drawing attention from across the entire venue. I could see people streaming over from other sections, drawn by the commotion and the sight of senior military officers in dress blues confronting civilian recruiters. When you dismiss their experience because it didn't happen in a corporate boardroom, you're not just insulting them personally. You're insulting every man and woman who has served this country with honor. You're saying that sacrifice and service don't matter unless they generate profit for shareholders. Patricia finally found her voice again, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. We didn't mean it that way. We just wanted to make sure candidates had relevant experience for the positions we're trying to fill. Relevant experience, Martinez repeated, his voice dripping with incredulity. Commander Davis managed a crew larger than most companies have employees. She operated in international waters where one wrong decision could start a war. She coordinated with foreign militaries, managed million-dollar budgets, and maintained operational readiness under conditions that would break most executives. How is that not relevant to corporate leadership? The question hung in the air like an accusation, because everyone in the crowd knew there wasn't a good answer. The experience was absolutely relevant. They just hadn't bothered to understand what it actually meant. That's when I heard the sound that made my blood run cold, the distinctive rumble of multiple diesel engines moving in convoy formation. Through the convention center's glass doors, I could see a line of military vehicles pulling into the parking lot with the kind of coordinated precision that spoke of serious business. Captain Walsh checked her phone and nodded. Right on time. The convoy that pulled into the Phoenix Convention Center parking lot wasn't the kind of casual military presence you might see at a recruiting event. These were official vehicles, the kind with enough communications equipment to run a small military operation, moving with the sort of precision that suggested serious business. Through the glass doors, I could see uniformed personnel exiting the vehicles with the efficient movements of people who had been briefed on a specific mission. Captain Walsh's phone buzzed, and she glanced at it before looking directly at me. Commander Davis, I need you to know that what's about to happen isn't punishment or discipline. It's recognition. Someone with enough stars on their collar finally decided that the way transitioning veterans have been treated in the civilian job market constitutes a national security issue. The words hit me like a physical blow. National security issue. That wasn't the kind of language the military used lightly, and it suggested that my morning of humiliation was part of something much larger than just one frustrated veteran trying to find civilian employment. Rodriguez stepped closer, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "Ma'am, there have been reports coming in from career fairs across the country. Decorated officers being told they're unqualified for entry-level positions. Combat veterans with decades of leadership experience being dismissed by 25-year-old corporate recruiters who've never managed anything more complicated than a coffee shop."
Someone upstairs decided it was time to make a statement. The implications of what he was saying began to sink in. This wasn't just about me, or even just about this career fair. This was about a systematic pattern of disrespect toward military service members, and apparently, someone with enough authority to mobilize convoy-level resources had decided to address it publicly. The first person through the convention center doors was a Navy commander I didn't recognize, moving with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested he was operating under direct orders from someone significantly higher up the chain of command. Behind him came a small entourage of personnel from various branches, all in dress uniforms, all looking like they were here on official business. The convention center had gone completely quiet now. Hundreds of job seekers and corporate recruiters watching as military personnel made their way through the venue toward our corner. The corporate recruiters who had been so dismissive earlier were now looking like they wanted to disappear into the floor. Commander Hayes, according to his name tag, approached our group with the kind of formal bearing that made everyone in the vicinity automatically stand a little straighter. "Commander Davis," he said, his voice carrying across the now silent convention center. "I'm Commander Hayes, Naval Personnel Command. I'm here to inform you that your separation from active duty has been temporarily suspended pending a full review of your service record and current circumstances." The words hit me like lightning. Separation suspended. That meant I wasn't technically a civilian anymore, which changed everything about this situation. It meant that every insult, every dismissive comment, every condescending suggestion that I needed basic training in business skills had been directed at an active-duty military officer. Patricia's face had gone completely white. She was staring at Commander Hayes like he was speaking in a foreign language, probably trying to process the fact that she'd spent the morning insulting someone who was apparently still on active duty. "Furthermore," Commander Hayes continued, his voice carrying easily across the silent convention center, "there are several matters of national importance that require your immediate attention. Your experience with international maritime operations has become directly relevant to current strategic initiatives." The crowd of corporate recruiters was starting to look genuinely panicked now. Being dismissive to a veteran looking for work was one thing, but insulting an active-duty officer who was apparently involved in matters of national importance was something else entirely. Martinez stepped forward, addressing the crowd of civilians who were still gathered around us. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you've witnessed here today is exactly why we have problems with veteran employment in this country. You've been talking to one of the finest officers the Navy has ever produced like she was some kind of charity case who needed your pity." Commander Hayes pulled out a folder and opened it, reading from what appeared to be official documentation. "Commander Sarah Davis, your service record indicates 3 combat deployments, exceptional fitness reports, and command of one of the most advanced warships in the fleet. Your tactical decisions during the Strait of Hormuz crisis have been incorporated into Naval War College curriculum as examples of exemplary leadership under pressure." The Naval War College? My actions were being taught to future naval officers as examples of how to handle international incidents. That information hit the crowd like a physical blow, and I could see several of the corporate recruiters looking like they wanted to crawl under their tables. Captain Walsh stepped forward, addressing the crowd directly. "What Commander Davis experienced here today is happening to veterans across this country. Highly qualified, extensively trained military personnel are being told by civilian employers that their experience doesn't matter, that they need to start over at entry-level positions, that military service isn't real leadership." The woman from Global Tech was frantically whispering to someone on her phone,
probably trying to explain to her supervisor how she just insulted a naval officer whose tactical decisions were being taught at the War College. The conversation wasn't going well, judging by her expression. Commander Hayes continued reading from the folder. Commander Davis, you are hereby recalled to active duty for a special assignment involving coordination with Allied naval forces in the Eastern Mediterranean. Your experience with international maritime operations and crisis management has been specifically requested by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest level of military command in the United States. They wanted me back, not for some routine assignment, but for something involving Allied coordination and crisis management, the kind of assignment that could affect international relations and national security. The tech global recruiter who had told me I needed an MBA was now standing at the back of the crowd looking like he was hoping no one would remember his earlier comments. But Rodriguez hadn't forgotten, and he wasn't about to let him off the hook. You, Rodriguez said, pointing directly at the tech global recruiter, you told Commander Davis that she needed to go back to school to learn actual business skills. You said military leadership wasn't real leadership. You want to explain that to the Joint Chiefs of Staff? The recruiter opened his mouth, then closed it again, apparently realizing that anything he said would just make the situation worse. There was no good way to explain why he dismissed someone who was about to be recalled to active duty for a special assignment at the highest levels of government. Captain Walsh turned to address the broader crowd that was now gathered around us. This is what disrespecting military service looks like. It's not just hurting individual veterans, it's wasting human resources that this country spent millions of dollars and years of training to develop. When you tell a decorated officer that their experience doesn't matter, you're throwing away expertise that can't be replaced. I could see other veterans in the crowd nodding along, probably remembering their own experiences with dismissive civilian employers. There was something building here, a sense of vindication and shared frustration that had been simmering under the surface for years. Commander Hayes closed the folder and looked directly at me. Commander Davis, you have 24 hours to report to Naval District Washington for briefing on your new assignment. Transportation has been arranged. Your country needs you back. The words sent a thrill through me that I'd been trying to suppress for 6 months. My country needs me back. After months of being told that my experience didn't matter, that I needed to start over and learn basic skills, someone at the highest levels of government had decided that what I'd learned in 12 years of military service was exactly what they needed. Patricia finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Commander Davis, I want to apologize for everything I said earlier. I had no idea about your background or your qualifications. If there's anything I can do to make this right, you can stop doing it to other veterans, I said, looking not just at Patricia, but at all the corporate recruiters who were gathered around us. You can start listening when military personnel tell you about their experience instead of immediately assuming they're unqualified for anything more challenging than customer service.
Martinez stepped forward, his Marine bearing making his presence impossible to ignore. Every year, thousands of highly trained, extensively educated military personnel transition to civilian careers. These are people who have been tested under conditions most of you can't imagine, who have managed budgets and personnel that dwarf most corporate operations, who have made life-and-death decisions under pressure. The silence in the convention center was absolute now. Hundreds of people were listening to every word, and I could see phones recording the conversation from multiple angles. This was going to end up on social media, probably within hours. And every year, Martinez continued, these same people are told by civilian employers that their experience doesn't count, that military service isn't real leadership, that they need to start over and prove themselves in entry-level positions. It's not just insulting, it's a waste of national resources. Commander Hayes stepped forward again, addressing the crowd of corporate recruiters directly. Ladies and gentlemen, you've just witnessed something that's been happening across this country for years. Highly qualified veterans being dismissed and disrespected by employers who don't understand what military service actually means. He gestured toward me. Commander Davis isn't an exception. She's representative of thousands of transitioning service members who have been told their experience doesn't matter. The difference is that today, someone decided to do something about it. The implication was clear. This wasn't just a coincidence or a random occurrence. This had been planned, orchestrated to make a point about how veterans were being treated in the civilian job market. Captain Walsh pulled out her phone and made another call. "This is Captain Walsh. Yes, sir, the demonstration was successful. Full documentation of the interactions has been recorded. We'll have a complete report within 24 hours. Demonstration. The word hit me like a physical blow. This had all been planned, from my presence at the career fair to the convoy's arrival. I'd been participating in some kind of official demonstration without even knowing it. Rodriguez must have seen the expression on my face because he stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Ma'am, your separation paperwork was never actually final. Someone upstairs has been tracking your job search, documenting the responses you've been getting. This morning was the culmination of months of investigation into how veterans are being treated in the civilian employment market." The pieces began falling into place. The timing of my separation, the fact that I'd been having the same conversation with recruiter after recruiter, the systematic dismissal of my qualifications despite their obvious relevance to corporate leadership. Someone had been watching, documenting, building a case. "The Joint Chief's assignment is real," Commander Hayes said, apparently reading my thoughts. "Your experience is genuinely needed for current operations, but the timing of today's events was coordinated to make a point about veteran employment issues." I felt a mixture of relief and embarrassment. Relief that I was going back to a world where my experience was valued and respected. Embarrassment that I'd been used as an unwitting participant in what amounted to a public relations operation. But as I looked around at the faces of the corporate recruiters who had dismissed me so casually, I realized that maybe this was exactly what needed to happen. Maybe it was time for civilian employers to understand that military experience wasn't something to be dismissed or condescended to. Patricia was still standing behind her booth, looking like she wanted to disappear. "Commander Davis," she said, her voice shaking slightly, "I want you to know that Meridian Financial Services will be implementing new training protocols for our recruiters. We'll be bringing in consultants to help us better understand military experience and how it translates to corporate leadership." "That's a start," I said, though I couldn't keep the edge completely out of my voice. But understanding military experience isn't complicated. When someone tells you they commanded a warship, they're telling you they managed hundreds of people and millions of dollars of equipment under conditions where mistakes could cost lives. That's not abstract leadership. That's concrete, measurable performance under the highest possible stakes. The Tech Global recruiter finally worked up the courage to approach me, his earlier arrogance completely gone. "Commander Davis, I realize I made serious errors of judgment earlier. Tech Global would be honored to discuss opportunities with you when you complete your current assignment." "No," I said simply. "You had your chance to recognize qualifications when they were presented to you. You chose to dismiss them because they came with a military background instead of a corporate pedigree. That tells me everything I need to know about your company's values." Commander Hayes checked his watch and looked at me. "Commander Davis, we need to begin your transition back to active duty. There are briefings scheduled and preparations to be made." The idea of putting on a uniform again, of stepping back into a world where my experience was valued and my judgment was trusted, was more appealing than I'd expected. 6 months of civilian job hunting had been 6 months of constant rejection and dismissal. Going back to active duty felt like coming home. As we began walking toward the exit, followed by the military personnel who had arrived with the convoy, I could hear conversations breaking out throughout the convention center. Veterans who had been watching the entire exchange were talking to other job seekers, explaining what military service actually meant, what kind of training and experience it represented. Rodriguez fell into step beside me as we walked toward the doors. "Ma'am,
This is going to change things. Not overnight, but it's a start. When this gets out, when companies see what happened here today, they're going to think twice before dismissing military experience. I hoped he was right. For the sake of all the veterans who were still struggling to translate their military experience into civilian opportunities, who were being told that their years of service didn't matter in the real world.
Captain Walsh was walking on my other side, her expression thoughtful. Commander, I want you to know that what you experienced today wasn't unique. We've documented similar incidents at career fairs across the country. This demonstration was designed to highlight a systematic problem with how veterans are treated in the civilian job market. The convoy was waiting in the parking lot, engines running, ready to transport me back to a world where my experience mattered. As I approached the lead vehicle, I turned back to look at the convention center, where hundreds of people were still talking about what they'd witnessed. Through the glass doors, I could see Patricia still standing at her booth, probably trying to figure out how to explain to her supervisors that she'd spent the morning insulting a naval officer who was about to be recalled to active duty for a special assignment. The woman from Global Tech was still on her phone, her conversation apparently not going well. Rodriguez opened the door of the lead vehicle for me, his expression respectful, in a way that reminded me of what I'd been missing during my months as a civilian job seeker. "Ma'am, it's good to have you back." As the convoy pulled out of the parking lot, I watched the convention center disappear behind us. In a few hours, I'd be back in uniform, back in a world where my experience was valued and my judgment was trusted, back where decisions mattered and leadership meant something more than quarterly profit reports. But I also knew that thousands of other veterans were still out there, still trying to convince civilian employers that their military experience had value, still being told that they needed to start over and learn basic business skills. The demonstration at the career fair might help some of them, might make some employers think twice before dismissing military qualifications. The real question was whether this single incident would be enough to change a system that had been failing veterans for years, or whether it would take many more demonstrations before civilian employers finally understood that military service wasn't a liability to be overcome, but an asset to be valued. As we drove toward the airport and my return to active duty, I found myself hoping that the next veteran who walked into a career fair would be treated with the respect their service had earned, rather than the condescension I'd experienced. Because every person who puts on a uniform deserves better than being told their sacrifice doesn't matter in the real world. The convoy rolled through Phoenix traffic with the kind of purpose that spoke of important missions and urgent deadlines. Behind us, at the convention center, the conversations would continue, the recordings would be shared, and maybe, just maybe, the next decorated veteran looking for civilian employment would find a world that finally understood what their service was worth. 3 months later, I stood on the bridge of the USS Constellation, watching the sun rise over the eastern Mediterranean while coordinating a complex multinational naval exercise that involved ships from 7 different countries. The assignment from the Joint Chiefs had turned out to be exactly the kind of challenge I'd been trained for, the kind that required every skill I'd developed over 12 years of naval service. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now managing an operation involving more personnel and resources than all the companies at that Phoenix career fair combined, while corporate recruiters back home were probably still telling veterans that military experience didn't translate to real-world leadership. Commander Hayes had been right about the demonstration's impact. Within weeks of the career fair incident, videos of the confrontation had gone viral across social media platforms. The hashtag #VeteranExperienceMatters had trended for days, with thousands of veterans sharing their own stories of being dismissed by civilian employers who didn't understand what military service actually meant. My phone buzzed with a text from Rodriguez, who had been keeping me updated on developments back home. The message was brief but significant. Meridian Financial just hired their first veteran VP. Patricia personally recommended him based on his military leadership experience. Things are changing, ma'am. The changes weren't happening overnight, but they were happening. Major corporations had begun reaching out to military transition programs, asking for guidance on how to properly evaluate veteran candidates. Several companies had implemented new interview protocols specifically designed to help recruiters understand military experience and its civilian applications. Captain Walsh had forwarded me reports from career fairs across the country where the reception for veterans had noticeably improved. Recruiters were asking better questions, listening more carefully to military backgrounds, and making genuine efforts to understand how combat leadership translated to corporate environments. But perhaps more importantly, veterans themselves were approaching the job search process differently. Instead of apologizing for their military background or trying to minimize their service experience, they were presenting their qualifications with the confidence they'd earned through years of proven performance under pressure. The morning watch rotation arrived on the bridge, and I prepared to hand over command for a few hours of rest. As I reviewed the operational status with my replacement, I reflected on how different this felt from those months of civilian job hunting. Here, my decisions mattered. My experience was valued. My judgment was trusted without question. The multinational exercise we were conducting involved coordinating air and sea assets from the United States, Britain, France, Italy, Greece, Turkey, and Israel. Each country had different procedures, different communication protocols, and different operational priorities. Managing that complexity required exactly the kind of diplomatic skill and strategic thinking that corporate recruiters had told me military officers couldn't provide. My executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Park, approached with the morning intelligence briefing. "Ma'am, we've received updated tasking from Naval Forces Europe. The exercise scenario is being modified to include a simulated humanitarian crisis requiring immediate multinational response." I nodded, already thinking through the logistical challenges. Humanitarian response operations were among the most complex missions the Navy undertook, requiring coordination between military and civilian agencies, international partners, and non-governmental organizations. They demanded the kind of flexible thinking and rapid decision-making that corporate recruiters had told me military officers couldn't provide. Within hours, we were coordinating a simulated evacuation operation involving helicopter assets from 3 different countries, medical support from 2 others, and logistics coordination with civilian maritime traffic in one of the world's busiest shipping lanes. The operation required real-time problem-solving, resource allocation, and personnel management under conditions that would have overwhelmed most corporate executives. As I watched the exercise unfold from the bridge, I couldn't help but think about Patricia and the other recruiters who had dismissed my qualifications so casually. They had looked at 12 years of exactly this kind of experience and seen nothing relevant to corporate leadership. The disconnect was so fundamental that it was almost incomprehensible. My phone rang with a call from Commander Hayes back at Naval Personnel Command. "Commander Davis, I wanted to update you on the Veteran Employment Initiative that grew out of your career fair incident. We've had preliminary meetings with major corporations, and the response has been more positive than we expected. The initiative, officially called the Military Civilian Leadership Translation Program, is designed to help both veterans and civilian employers better understand how military experience applies to corporate environments. It includes workshops for recruiters, transition seminars for veterans, and a database of military occupational specialties matched to civilian career fields. More importantly," Hayes continued, "we've seen a significant improvement in employment outcomes for transitioning officers. The placement rate for field gauge officers in leadership positions has increased by almost 40% since the demonstration." 40%. That represented hundreds of highly qualified veterans who are now finding positions that actually utilize their training and experience instead of being forced into entry-level roles that wasted their expertise. The exercise continued throughout the day, presenting new challenges that required constant adaptation and creative problem-solving. By evening, we had successfully completed a complex multinational operation that involved coordinating assets worth billions of dollars and thousands of personnel across multiple time zones and languages. As I reviewed the after-action reports that night in my stateroom, I received an email that made me smile. It was from Martinez, the Marine recruiter who had been at the career fair. He was writing to let me know that the military recruiting stations had seen a significant increase in inquiries from corporate executives who wanted to understand military training and leadership development. "Turns out," he wrote, "when business leaders actually see what military leadership looks like, they want to figure out how to develop those same capabilities in their own organizations."
Several Fortune 500 companies have asked about adapting military leadership training for their management development programs. The transformation was more comprehensive than anyone had expected. Instead of just changing how veterans were perceived in the job market, The demonstration had sparked broader conversations about leadership, training, and professional development across multiple industries. A few weeks later, I received a personal letter that meant more to me than any official recognition. It was from a Navy Chief Petty Officer who was transitioning after 20 years of service. She wrote about her experience at a recent career fair, where recruiters had listened respectfully to her background and asked thoughtful questions about her leadership experience. "Commander," she wrote, "I don't know if you'll remember me, but I was at the Phoenix Career Fair that day, watching from the back of the crowd. What happened to you that morning was happening to all of us, but nobody had ever stood up and called it what it was. When those officers showed up and made everyone understand who you really were, it changed something for all of us." She had been hired as a senior operations manager at a logistics company, where her experience managing supply chains for deployed military units was finally being recognized as directly relevant to civilian operations. Her military background wasn't something she had to overcome or apologize for. It was the primary reason she'd been hired. The letter continued with updates from other veterans who had been at the career fair that day. The Army sergeant who had been told he was overqualified for management positions was now a regional director for a major retailer. The Air Force captain who had been advised to consider community college was working as a project manager for an aerospace contractor. But the changes weren't limited to individual success stories. The demonstration had triggered a broader examination of how American businesses evaluated and utilized military talent. Congressional hearings had been held on veteran employment issues. Professional organizations had developed new certification programs for recruiters working with military candidates. Most significantly, the Department of Defense had partnered with the Department of Labor to create a comprehensive database linking military occupational specialties to civilian career fields, complete with detailed explanations of how military experience translated to corporate environments. As my deployment in the Mediterranean neared its end, I found myself thinking about what came next. The special assignment would eventually conclude, and I would face the same transition decision that had led me to that Phoenix career fair months earlier. But the landscape had changed dramatically since then. Commander Hayes had already reached out with several opportunities, both military and civilian. Defense contractors who understood the value of military leadership experience were actively recruiting transitioning officers. Major corporations had developed fast-track programs for military candidates. Even traditional industries that had never seriously considered military backgrounds were now actively seeking veteran talent. The final exercise of our deployment involved a scenario that brought together everything we had learned about multinational cooperation and crisis response. A simulated natural disaster required immediate humanitarian response across multiple countries, involving not just military assets, but coordination with civilian agencies, international relief organizations, and commercial shipping. Standing on the bridge during the height of the exercise, managing communications with dozens of different organizations while coordinating rescue operations across hundreds of square miles of ocean, I realized that this was exactly the kind of complex leadership challenge that corporate America needed. The ability to make rapid decisions with incomplete information, to coordinate diverse teams toward common objectives, to maintain operational effectiveness under extreme pressure. These were the skills that military service developed, skills that were directly transferable to civilian leadership challenges. The fact that it had taken a public demonstration to make that connection obvious said more about civilian preconceptions than it did about military capabilities. As we completed the final exercise and began preparations for our return to home port, I received one last update from Rodriguez. The Phoenix Convention Center had implemented a new policy requiring all career fair participants to complete training on military experience and veteran employment issues. The same venue where I had been dismissed and condescended to was now leading efforts to ensure veterans received respectful and informed treatment. 6 months after that humiliating morning in Phoenix, the conversation about veteran employment had fundamentally changed. Instead of being told that military experience didn't matter, Veterans were being actively recruited by organizations that understood the value of military training and leadership development. The demonstration had accomplished something that years of individual advocacy couldn't achieve. It had forced a public reckoning with how American businesses treated the men and women who had served their country, and it had created momentum for systematic change across multiple industries. As our ship entered Norfolk Naval Base and I prepared to transition back to shore duty, I knew that whatever came next, it would be different from my first attempt at civilian employment. The landscape had changed, not just for me, but for thousands of veterans who would follow. The real victory wasn't just in changing perceptions about military experience. It was in creating a system where veterans could transition to civilian careers with dignity, where their years of service were recognized as assets rather than obstacles, and where the leadership skills developed through military service were valued in the civilian world. Standing on the pier as our crew disembarked, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with the end of deployment. The demonstration at the Phoenix Career Fair had been about more than just one frustrated veteran seeking employment. It had been about respect, recognition, and the fundamental value of service to country. The conversation would continue, the changes would evolve, and there would undoubtedly be setbacks along the way. But something fundamental had shifted in how American businesses understood military experience, and that shift would benefit veterans for years to come.
The executives around the table were treating military leadership principles not as curiosities or feel-good initiatives, but as proven methodologies that could provide competitive advantages in an increasingly complex business environment. During lunch, I had a chance to speak privately with Patricia about her transformation from dismissive recruiter to military advocate. Her evolution reflected the broader changes that had occurred across multiple industries since the career fair incident. "I've spent the last 2 years learning about military leadership development," she said, her voice carrying a note of genuine respect that had been completely absent during our first encounter. "What I discovered is that everything we're trying to teach in corporate leadership programs, you already learn in military service. Decision-making under pressure, resource management, team building, crisis response, strategic planning, it's all there." She paused, looking out at the Phoenix skyline. "The truth is, I was threatened by your qualifications. Here was someone with more leadership experience than I'd ever have, and instead of recognizing that, I tried to diminish it. The demonstration forced me to confront my own biases and ignorance." The conversation was interrupted by Martinez, who had transitioned out of the Marines and was now working as a senior consultant for veteran employment initiatives. He brought news from the latest round of career fairs across the country, where the reception for military candidates had changed dramatically. "It's like night and day," he reported. "Recruiters are actively seeking out military candidates, asking detailed questions about leadership experience, and offering positions that actually utilize military training. The companies that were dismissive 2 years ago are now competing to hire veterans." The afternoon session focused on international implementation of the military leadership program. Companies operating in volatile international markets had discovered that executives with military backgrounds were particularly effective at managing operations in challenging environments, navigating complex regulatory frameworks, and maintaining organizational effectiveness under pressure. One of the most significant developments had been the creation of fast-track executive programs specifically designed for transitioning military officers. Instead of being told they needed to start at entry-level positions, qualified veterans were being recruited directly into senior management roles, where their experience was immediately applicable. The contract we were negotiating represented just one example of how dramatically the landscape had changed. 2 years earlier, I had been told I was unqualified for basic management positions. Now, Fortune 500 companies were competing to license leadership development programs based on military training methodologies. But the changes extended beyond just employment opportunities. Military leadership principles were being incorporated into business school curricula, management development programs, and corporate training initiatives. The demonstration had sparked academic research into military leadership effectiveness, with studies consistently showing superior performance outcomes for organizations led by veterans.
As the meeting concluded, I reflected on the unexpected journey from that humiliating morning at the career fair to this boardroom negotiation. The transformation hadn't just been about changing perceptions of military experience. It had been about recognizing the fundamental value of service-oriented leadership in civilian organizations. The contract we finalized that afternoon would bring military leadership development to thousands of civilian managers across multiple industries. The program would teach corporate executives the same decision-making processes, crisis management techniques, and team leadership principles that military service had taught me over 12 years of active duty. Rodriguez walked with me to the parking garage after the meeting, both of us aware that we were witnessing something historic. "Ma'am, what happened in Phoenix wasn't just about one career fair or one frustrated veteran. It was about forcing this country to recognize what it was throwing away when it dismissed military experience." He was right. The demonstration had exposed a systematic waste of human resources, a failure to recognize and utilize the leadership talent that military service developed. The changes that followed represented not just better employment outcomes for veterans, but improved organizational effectiveness for the companies that learned to value military experience. Driving home that evening, I passed the Phoenix Convention Center where everything had started. The marquee outside advertised the upcoming Military Leadership Summit, an event that would bring together hundreds of corporate executives eager to learn from military leadership principles. The same venue where I had been dismissed and condescended to was now celebrating military expertise. The real victory wasn't personal vindication or career success. It was systemic change that would benefit thousands of veterans for years to come. The demonstration had created momentum for a fundamental shift in how American businesses understood and valued military service, transforming military experience from a perceived liability into a recognized asset. That night, I received an email from a Navy lieutenant who was preparing to transition after her first tour. She had been following the career developments since Phoenix and wanted advice on her civilian job search. Her message reflected a confidence and optimism that would have been impossible just 2 years earlier. "Commander, I'm not worried about finding employment. Based on everything that's happened since Phoenix, I know that companies finally understand what military leadership means. I'm confident that my service experience will be valued and respected." Her confidence was well-founded. The landscape had changed so dramatically that transitioning veterans could approach civilian employment with the expectation that their military background would be seen as an advantage rather than an obstacle. The conversation had shifted from justifying military experience to leveraging it for competitive advantage. The Phoenix incident had accomplished something that individual advocacy could never achieve. It had forced a public reckoning with systematic disrespect toward military service and created institutional changes that would benefit veterans for generations. The demonstration had been about more than just employment. It had been about recognition, respect, and the fundamental value of service to country. As I prepared for bed that night, I felt a sense of completion that extended far beyond personal career success. The changes that began with one humiliating morning at a career fair had created opportunities for thousands of veterans and improved organizational effectiveness for hundreds of companies. The demonstration had proven that when military experience was properly understood and valued, everyone benefited. The conversation would continue to evolve, new challenges would emerge, and there would undoubtedly be setbacks along the way, but something fundamental had shifted in American business culture. A recognition that military service developed exactly the kind of leadership capabilities that organizations needed to succeed in an increasingly complex world. 2 years after Phoenix, the question was no longer whether military experience was relevant to civilian leadership. The question was how quickly organizations could learn to leverage that experience for competitive advantage. The demonstration had changed not just individual careers, but an entire system of how America utilized its most extensively trained leadership talent.